I'm sorry, I just want to go. Hello? I'm sorry, I just want to see my family. Hello?
A young mother was bound, blindfolded, and dragged out of her own home in broad daylight. She was restrained, sexually assaulted, shot in the head, and then buried in a shallow grave in a cold, desolate swamp. All of it happened within a few hours. Not days, not a prolonged disappearance, but a rapid, controlled sequence of savage, brutal acts. Her name was Denise Amber Lee, 21 years old, a mother of 2 children too young to understand what had happened. This was not a mysterious vanishing. This was a brazen abduction, a vicious crime that took place right inside the victim's own home. And what makes this case more horrifying than anything else is that Denise called 911 while she was still alive, not just once, multiple calls, from her directly, from people who saw her trapped in the vehicle, banging on the windows, desperately pleading for help. And no one saved her. The perpetrator was Michael King, 31 years old in 2008. He drove a 1995 green Chevrolet Camaro, moving through a sparsely populated neighborhood in Northport, Florida, an area so quiet it became the perfect setting for a predator to strike. He controlled, tortured, and then tried to conceal everything he had done. This is the case of a mother who fought until her final moments yet was left in agony. And every detail you are about to hear is verified through court records, police reports, 911 data, and official investigative documents. On January 19, 2008, 2 days after Denise Amber Lee disappeared, the search ended with a shocking and heartbreaking discovery in a damp, low-lying swamp area in Northport, Florida. A K-9 unit stopped at a patch of disturbed ground about 800 meters from where Michael King had been pulled over. The top layer of soil was fresh, soft, and had not yet settled. When search teams dug down, they found Denise's body in a shallow grave that had been hastily covered. Her body was unclothed, exposing the full extent of a horrific crime. Both wrists showed clear bruising, indicating she had been tightly bound for an extended period. Injuries across her body reflected prolonged abuse, not a single incident, but repeated over time before death occurred. Forensic findings documented severe sexual assault accompanied by abrasions and trauma in multiple areas, consistent with the victim desperately trying to resist. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that Denise never stopped trying to escape her captor's control, even while restrained and exhausted. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the head, above the right eyebrow. The bullet was fired at close range with the intent to kill. However, the autopsy revealed that death was not instantaneous. Blood was found in Denise's lungs, a critical detail proving she was still breathing after being shot. This meant the victim endured her final moments in severe pain, grave injury, and without any aid. There was no evidence that the perpetrator attempted to render aid or alleviate her condition after the shot. Instead, scene evidence showed that immediately after the crime, Michael King proceeded to bury the body to conceal his actions. The grave was shallow, and surrounding marks indicated the digging was done quickly and carelessly. A mud-covered shovel was later found in his vehicle upon arrest, matching the soil type at the scene. The burial location was in a remote swamp area with little foot traffic and poor visibility from a distance, showing the killer had chosen the site to avoid detection. The entire scene reflected a sequenced pattern of behavior, restraint, abuse, extreme violence, execution, and body disposal. There were no signs of panic or loss of control. Details collected from the scene and forensic conclusions all indicated that Denise had been kept bound and controlled for several hours before being shot. Marks on her body were consistent with confinement in a confined space and sustained contact from the perpetrator. After the body was discovered, authorities collected evidence from the scene, including soil, hair fibers, and remaining biological traces. These were later matched to items seized from Michael King's vehicle, forming a direct physical link between the perpetrator and the victim. The fact that the body was buried not far from where the suspect was stopped indicated the time between the crime and discovery was very short. This also aligned with the 911 call data and recorded travel times on January 17th. Denise's condition when found clearly reflected the extreme brutality of the violence she endured. The signs on her body not only showed abuse, but also a prolonged struggle before she was killed. All details from the way she was bound, the extent of injuries, the location of the gunshot wound, to the manner of burial demonstrated a controlled, deliberate, and clearly concealment-oriented sequence of actions. The investigation began on the afternoon of January 17, 2008, when around 3:30 p.m., Nathan Lee called 911 to report that his wife, Denise Amber Lee, had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Upon returning home from work, he found their 2 children still in the house, but Denise was gone. Her phone, keys, and purse were all still there, with no indication she had left voluntarily. An unlocked open window in the home made the scene highly unusual. This was the first time authorities were notified, but the full severity of the situation was not yet fully recognized. Just a few hours later, at 6:14 p.m. that same day, another 911 call was recorded, this time from Denise herself. She called from inside her abductor's vehicle, speaking in a low, controlled voice, trying to provide information while bound and blindfolded. She gave her name, confirmed she had been kidnapped, and described the vehicle the perpetrator was using. The call was interrupted when the abductor discovered it. Data from this call should have been a critical factor in locating the victim, but the phone used was a prepaid type without GPS, so location could only be triangulated from the nearest cell tower signal. The information obtained was not precise enough to pinpoint an exact location. In the following period, 911 dispatch continued to receive additional calls related to the same incident, but the information was not effectively connected. One came from Sabrina Muxlow, who provided details about a man and suspicious behavior involving the vehicle. Another came from Jane Kowalski, who directly saw a woman being held in a vehicle, banging on the windows, and showing clear signs of distress. Jane described the vehicle, direction of travel, and attempted to follow, but the information she provided was not fully entered into the system and was not relayed to patrolling units. Another call came from Harold Muxlow, who had contact with the perpetrator, reporting that a man had come to his home asking to borrow a shovel, gas can, and flashlight for unclear reasons. These calls, if properly handled and linked together, could have formed a clear picture of the suspect's location and actions. However, serious errors occurred in information processing, data was not fully entered into the system, calls were not properly prioritized, and most critically, no timely dispatch orders were issued for nearby units to intervene. Meanwhile, the perpetrator continued moving in the area with the restrained victim. At 9:16 p.m. that same day, a turning point occurred when a patrol officer spotted and stalked a green Chevrolet Camaro matching the earlier broadcast description. The driver was Michael King. At the time of the stop, he was alone. During the vehicle check, officers found a mud-covered shovel inside, his clothing wet from the waist down, and a cell phone with its battery removed. These details immediately raised suspicion that he had recently been in a muddy environment and had deliberately disabled phone tracking. During initial questioning, Michael King did not admit to the crime. He offered a fabricated story, claiming he too was a victim of an abduction, and that both he and Denise had been controlled by another man who released him first and took Denise away. This account did not match the collected facts and was quickly questioned. In the following days, when Denise's body was found on January 19th, the investigation shifted to solidifying evidence. Samples collected from the scene and the victim's body were sent for analysis. Results showed Michael King's DNA present on Denise's body, confirming direct contact and involvement in the sexual assault. In his vehicle, authorities found hair fibers matching Denise, along with a heart-shaped ring identified as hers. These items formed a clear physical chain linking the perpetrator, the vehicle, and the victim. Additionally, timing data from the 911 calls, witness statements, and the location of the vehicle stop showed consistency in time and space, eliminating the possibility of another suspect as claimed by Michael King. Factors such as the use of a prepaid phone, removing the battery afterward, having digging tools prepared, and choosing a swamp area for disposal all indicated calculated behavior. As the physical and forensic evidence gradually established Michael King's role in the case more clearly, the picture of his motive and preparation process also became more evident. Michael King moved from Michigan to Florida in 2002 after a failed marriage. In Northport, he lived a relatively isolated life, unstable in employment, and at the time of the crime, he had been unemployed for a period. On the surface, he was not someone with a serious prior criminal record, but information gathered afterward revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that had existed before. Many people in the area had reported his harassing women, making inappropriate approaches, and showing signs of violating personal boundaries. There was at least one allegation related to sexual misconduct, but it was either not officially reported or did not lead to legal action. These signs were not connected or properly assessed at the time, but in hindsight, they indicated a clear pattern of controlling and sexually deviant behavior. Psychologically, details from the crime scene and his actions showed that Michael King did not act in a state of loss of control. He demonstrated a tendency to seek absolute power over the victim, from restraining and binding her to maintaining control throughout the entire criminal process. The prolonged repeated abuse combined with the use of violence to enforce submission reflected a form of sexual deviance tied to control and domination. Before January 17, 2008, Michael King had visited a local shooting range. Records from the facility confirmed that he had spent time practicing with firearms, a detail significant in the context of the victim later being shot at close range. This was not a random act on the day of the crime, but part of a preparatory sequence. Regarding vehicles and tools, he used a 1995 green Chevrolet Camaro, a personal vehicle that allowed flexible movement in the area. Inside the car, police found duct tape, a mud-covered shovel, and other items consistent with restraint and body disposal. Carrying a shovel either before or during the crime showed he had anticipated the need to bury the body. Additionally, using a prepaid phone and removing the battery afterward demonstrated awareness of avoiding tracking. As for target selection, the Northport area where Denise lived was characterized by sparse population, many vacant homes following the housing crisis, large distances between houses, and little daytime traffic, especially during work hours. This was an environment conducive to approaching without being noticed. Denise was home alone with her 2 young children while her husband was at work, a factor that made her an easily controllable target. There was no evidence that Michael King had any prior relationship with Denise, indicating the victim selection was opportunistic but still within a calculated framework regarding environment and conditions. Combining factors from his past behavior, psychological state, preparatory actions, and method of execution, it is clear that the crime was not the result of a momentary impulse. Every step in the sequence, from choosing the area, approaching the victim, using tools for restraint, committing the abuse, using a weapon to kill, to concealing the body, showed initiative and planning. No element in the record indicated panic or loss of control leading to the crime. On the contrary, all details reflected a deliberate process in which the perpetrator prepared the means, tools, and conditions necessary to carry out the acts without immediate detection. The trial of Michael King took place in 2009 in the state of Florida, nearly 2 years after the crime, in a context where all investigative evidence had been completed and public opinion remained haunted by the brutality of the offense. The defendant faced multiple serious charges, including kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder, with the first-degree murder charge carrying the possibility of the death penalty under Florida law. From the early days of the trial, prosecutors built a chain of arguments based on physical evidence, forensic results, and timeline data to prove that Michael King's actions were not only intentional, but executed in a clearly calculated sequence. The centerpiece of the prosecution was the DNA analysis results showing Michael King's presence on the victim's body, reinforcing the sexual assault allegations. Samples collected at the scene, including soil, biological traces, and burial location, were matched to items seized from the defendant's vehicle, forming a direct chain of connection. Additionally, strands of Denise's hair and her heart-shaped ring found in Michael King's car were presented in court as undeniable physical evidence. Another key element was the reconstruction of the timeline based on the 911 calls on January 17, 2008. Prosecutors detailed the time points, from the husband's missing person call around 3:30 p.m. to Denise's call at 6:14 p.m., and subsequent calls from witnesses such as Sabrina Muxlow, Jane Kowalski, and Harold Muxlow. Placing these calls on the same timeline showed the perpetrator's continuous movement in the area, while highlighting the period when the victim was still alive and attempting to seek help. This data was combined with the location where Michael King was stopped at 9:16 p.m. to prove he was the only person present throughout the entire sequence of events. In addition, the prosecution emphasized the defendant's prior preparatory actions, including visiting the shooting range before the crime day and carrying tools such as duct tape and a shovel, indicating deliberate preparation. In contrast to this tight chain of evidence, the defense's strategy focused on maintaining the story Michael King had offered from the beginning, that he too was a victim of an abduction carried out by a third party. The defendant continued to deny all direct allegations, refused to admit to the assault or murder, and provided no reasonable explanation for the presence of his DNA on the victim's body. Defense attorneys attempted to create reasonable doubt by questioning the accuracy of some data and the possibility of another suspect, but they offered no specific evidence to support this hypothesis. Throughout the trial, Denise Amber Lee's family attended court following every development. They provided testimony about Denise's life, her role in the family, and what they had endured since she went missing. These statements were not only personal, but also helped clarify the impact of the crime on secondary victims, especially Denise's 2 young children. One element discussed during the trial was the role of the 911 system on the day of the crime. Although not directly related to determining the defendant's guilt, the 911 calls and their handling were presented as part of the context, showing that much information had been provided while the victim was still alive. This data helped reinforce the timeline and clarify the period during which the perpetrator carried out the crime. After reviewing all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury deliberated. With the clear volume of physical and forensic evidence combined with the inconsistencies in the defendant's statements, the jury quickly reached consensus on the charges. Michael King was found guilty of kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. On August 28, 2009, the court proceeded with sentencing Michael King, closing the trial phase but doing nothing to diminish the level of grief the case left behind. In light of all the evidence presented throughout the trial, the sentence handed down reflected the extreme severity and brutality of the criminal acts. For the rape charge, Michael King was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For the kidnapping charge, he received life imprisonment. And for the first-degree murder charge, the court imposed the maximum penalty under Florida law, the death penalty. These three sentences did not stand alone but combined into an overall sentence, demonstrating that the justice system clearly recognized the particularly egregious nature of the case, including the restraint of the victim, prolonged abuse, extreme use of force, and post-crime concealment behavior. When the sentence was announced, Michael King's reaction showed no clear signs of remorse or awareness of the consequences he had caused. Throughout the trial process and at the time of sentencing, he continued to maintain his position of denial, refusing to accept responsibility for acts proven by physical and forensic evidence. No direct apology was offered to the victim's family, nor was there any acknowledgement of the chain of actions that led to Denise Amber Lee's death. His continued adherence to the false story he had offered from the beginning, that he too was a victim of an abduction, showed a consistent pattern of behavior, denial, evasion, and refusal to take responsibility. This attitude was clearly evident even when facing the death penalty, a factor that often leads defendants in similar cases to show some change in speech or behavior. In contrast, Michael King displayed no such indication. For Denise Amber Lee's family, the moment of sentencing did not bring complete closure, but was merely one step in facing their loss. They were present in court, witnessing the entire process from the presentation of evidence to the pronouncement of sentence. What they endured was not only the loss of a loved one, but also watching every detail of the case recreated in court, from the abusive acts to the forensic outcomes. Their reaction extended beyond grief to include disappointment over what happened on January 17, 2008. They repeatedly stated that there had been opportunities to save Denise while she was still alive, and that those opportunities had not been utilized. The fact that the 911 system did not handle the calls effectively, did not connect the information, and did not dispatch units promptly was viewed by the family as a contributing factor to the outcome. Their statements in court and after the trial reflected this view, emphasizing that the sentence against the perpetrator was necessary but insufficient to address everything that had occurred. From a legal perspective, the imposition of the death penalty placed Michael King among death row inmates awaiting execution in Florida's correctional system. However, the execution process in the United States is often prolonged due to appeals and reviews, meaning the maximum sentence did not equate to immediate execution. Meanwhile, the other sentences, 30 years for rape and life for kidnapping, remained in place as part of the overall penalty. After the sentence was pronounced on August 28, 2009, the trial closed legally, but left many questions without fully satisfactory answers, especially when considering the defendant's attitude and what had happened beforehand. In his final statements to the court, Michael King offered no sincere apology to Denise Amber Lee or her family. He did not admit to the acts, showed no remorse, and continued to maintain his stance of denying responsibility, just as he had from the early days of questioning. There was no change in how he viewed what had happened, no sign of accepting the consequences or recognizing the brutality of his actions. That attitude appeared not only in his words, but throughout the entire trial process, from how he answered questions to how he reacted to the evidence presented. For many present in the courtroom, especially the victim's family, the absence of any apology or acknowledgement meant the trial ended without a true sense of closure. After the trial, Michael King was transferred to Union Correctional Institution in Florida, where death row inmates await execution. As of the current time, he remains there, awaiting the prolonged legal process related to carrying out the death sentence, including appeals and reviews under the U.S. justice system. This means that even though the maximum sentence was imposed, execution did not occur immediately and could extend over many years. Meanwhile, the other sentences, including 30 years for rape and life for kidnapping, continue as part of the overall penalty, ensuring that even if there is any change regarding the death penalty, the defendant remains accountable long-term for the other act. Beyond the legal proceedings involving the perpetrator, an important part of the story lies in what happened to the 911 system after the case. An internal investigation was conducted to review how the calls on January 17, 2008 were handled. The results showed multiple procedural errors, including failure to fully enter information into the system, failure to connect related calls, and failure to dispatch patrol units promptly. However, the measures applied were primarily internal disciplinary actions, including short-term suspensions and retraining requirements for some dispatch personnel. There were no immediate mandatory changes to the entire system, and no individual faced direct legal accountability. In response to what happened, Denise Amber Lee's family, particularly her father Rick Goff, began efforts to push for reform. On April 24, 2008, just months after the case, Florida passed a law named the Denise Amber Lee Act. This law aimed to improve training for 911 dispatchers, providing standards and guidelines for handling emergency calls more effectively. However, a limitation of the act was its non-mandatory nature, meaning agencies could adopt or not adopt it based on internal decisions. This led Denise's family to continue advocating for years afterward to demand mandatory statewide training and certification, with the goal of minimizing the chance of similar errors in the future. These efforts were not only personal but also reflected a broader issue concerning how emergency response systems operate in practice. In that context, one question continues to be raised, not only by the family but by those following the case. If the 911 calls on January 17 had been handled properly, if the information had been entered and relayed promptly, if patrol units had received accurate data on location and vehicle, could the outcome have been different? This question has no definitive answer, but the facts show that Denise had multiple opportunities to be found while still alive. She called 911, provided information, was seen by multiple witnesses, and was within a geographic range that authorities could have reached in a short time. These elements formed a chain of potential intervention points, but none were effectively utilized. Looking back at the entire case, from the moment Denise was abducted to when her body was discovered, three parallel factors stand out clearly: a victim who actively tried to survive, a perpetrator who carried out the acts with preparation and control, and a system that failed to respond promptly to the information provided. Denise took every action possible in her circumstances to increase her chances of rescue, from using the perpetrator's phone to call 911 to attracting the attention of passers-by. Michael King, in contrast, executed a calculated sequence of actions, from preparing tools and choosing the area to concealing the crime afterward. The 911 system, meanwhile, received multiple warning signals but failed to connect them into an effective response. These factors did not exist in isolation but interacted within the same time frame, leading to the final outcome. The victim did everything she could under the circumstances. The perpetrator carried out the acts with clear purpose and planning, and the system failed to seize the intervention opportunities when they arose. If you want to see more real cases analyzed in detail and straightforwardly like this, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching. See you in the next stories.